I am really pleased and to welcome you here this morning on behalf of CFA. I sit on the board of directors, and it really is our pleasure not only to have, again, the Ron Brown series, but to have the panel on trade and investment. Trade and investment is a very important issue for the African continent, and I think that there is a significant role that the diaspora has to play within the dynamic of promoting both trade and investment, and looking at how we may be able to increase and enhance our participation in the economies. I'm sure many of you know already that probably over half of the 20 fastest growing economies, I guess about 11 or 12 of them, are currently said to be on the continent. So how is it that we will be enabled to capitalize on some of the opportunities that are there? We have an extremely august panel this morning, and it will be chaired by Professor Kingsley Moholo, who is a dear friend to CFA and who I've known for many years. He has, you'll see his bio, an extremely, really strong background, strong career. We have Michael, who's come in from South Africa. Michael has been living on the continent. Oh, Michael, we go back a long time too, 20-some years, and has been in private practice in the private sector for quite some time on the continent. I'd say 25 plus years, perhaps, Michael, at this point. And then we have Dr. Felix Obi, who is coming to us from Maryland and Georgetown. He too has had a very strong career in trade and investment, and particularly with agencies I think that may be familiar to some of you. What I'd like to do is I will turn over the panel to Kingsley. He will moderate and carry on the discussion, and I hope that it is very fruitful and that you'll be able to take away some things and pose some good questions to our panelists after. With that, I turn it over to Kingsley.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Janine. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was here on Monday. I think I made a contribution to the governance panel, and I think we've had a very good meeting so far. We are here this morning to talk about U.S.-Africa trade and investment. And let me just make a few comments to frame the issues. The issues, I think, are one, what are the main channels of U.S.-Africa trade and investment at this point? Two, what are the opportunities that we should be looking at to improve U.S.-Africa trade and investment, make them a little bit more substantive or substantive as possible? We know in this context that Africa and China have had massively increased trade and investment over the past 10 years. And so we might also want to make comparisons. And then we need to talk about the role of the diaspora. How can the diaspora help to quadruple or basically ramp up U.S.-Africa trade and investment ties? Now, we know, and of course we'll be having two very distinguished panelists speak to us who Janine has introduced. Just to say a little bit about myself, even though I'm the moderator, but I used to be, I've been a professor of international business and public policy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston for the past couple of years. Now I'm transitioning to setting up a think tank based in Nigeria, the Institute for Governance and Economic Transformation, to see how we can create inclusive growth in African countries. And before I came to the Fletcher School, I was deputy governor of the Nigerian Central Bank for 5 years, from 2009 to 2014. The main avenue that we have seen for U.S.-Africa trade in the last several years has been the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. AGOA has a lot of interesting things. basically about 6,400 products from about 40 African countries that have duty-free access to the US, and has been the linchpin of the US-Africa trade relationship for the past, I would say, 2 decades. Now, it may not necessarily continue to be so, because the United States is signing various free trade agreements with other blocs, and that raises a lot of issues. I think we need to understand that US exports to Africa have been declining. Only 1.5% of US exports go to Africa at this time. One of the reasons for this is because 70 to 80% of the trade in AGOA, exports from Africa to the US, have been oil and minerals. I'm not sure if that was the original intent. And this, with the United States ramping up its own production of oil since 2014, therefore what they import from African countries has gone down quite precipitously, or perhaps by about 50% actually. So the AGOA has also stimulated some foreign investment in Africa. We have companies like Gap, Target, Old Navy, that are taking advantage of AGOA to source goods from African countries, and that's a good thing. However, the structural weakness of AGOA, I think, underlies the challenge that African countries face with global trade and foreign investment. A lot of times when we come to these forums, we speak from the perspective of the US only, but I'd like us to be able also to speak from the perspective of Africa. The US-Africa partnership is not just about the US. A partnership is a two-way thing. So it's important that we look at what's good for Africa as well, and we don't make so-called partnerships to become simply points of extraction or points of aid disguised as trade. We want real trade and investment, not aid disguised as trade. So, the whole question is that Africa, the structure of global trade, even the structure of the US-Africa trade relationship and AGOA, is not, in my view, allowing Africa to start, developing economic complexity, and that is the production and export of finished goods with value and insight added to them. That's, I think, the critical challenge for Africa. So if Africa is going to engage in partnerships with anywhere in the world, including the US, it must assess the success of those partnerships or the value of those partnerships from this perspective. US investments in Africa, on the other hand, should look at whether those investments are contributing to economic transformation in the continent while making money. It's not US businessmen are not NGOs, and they're supposed to make money. It's supposed to be a mutually beneficial thing. So how much investments, for example, do Americans put into manufacturing in Africa? And how much investments do they put into infrastructure? And things like that, that would clearly create an enabling environment. How much investments do they put into skills, the development of skills, educational and skills institutions? Foreign investments in any country ride on 2 things, location factors, infrastructure and skills. And these are the 2 things that are lacking in Africa. So what are the areas that a lot of US investment could go into in Africa? I think they could do a lot in the area of infrastructure. I forgot to mention Power Africa, and even it's quite relevant in the context of infrastructure. Power Africa, which is the initiative that Obama signed to create 30,000 megawatts of electricity before 2030, I think. So Power Africa is an important, in addition to AGOA, perhaps AGOA may increasingly even be a thing of the past, but Power Africa is a thing of the future. And so we have to interrogate Power Africa initiative to know whether it's actually achieving its objective or whether it can achieve its objective. Because if it does, then of course, Africa will have a very strong hand to play in these kinds of partnerships. If you have, I say this, look, all of the electricity produced in Africa, half of which is produced in South Africa, is just about the same amount of electricity produced in Spain. Africa's GDP of about 1 point something trillion dollars, the whole continent of 54 countries, is just about the GDP of Chicago, the GDP of Taiwan. So when we say Africa is rising, yes, Africa is emerging. But is Africa rising? We have actually to interrogate ourselves. And I'm hoping that the panel in their discussions will be able to point us forward on the path forward. So there are opportunities in education, there are opportunities in the IT sector, there are opportunities in venture capital finance, small business. Access to credit is a big problem for small businesses in Africa. So let me just wrap it up there. And one last word on diaspora. The diaspora are critical for the development of the continent. We know that they send billions and billions of dollars in remittances back home, especially in countries like Nigeria. This amounts to a significant economic asset. Nigeria has just issued diaspora bonds, I think of about $300 million recently. But there is no structured engagement of the diaspora by many African countries. And that's where the weakness is. Because as Ambassador Arikana Chihambori was saying on Monday, the diaspora have not organized themselves in such a way or in such a manner that they become a political and public policy force in Africa. And when they speak, the presidents and the governments have to listen to them. They haven't done that yet. And I think it's incumbent on the diasporans to do that. Unlike India, unlike China, unlike Israel. And we know that these countries use their diasporas to leap ahead quite significantly. So, challenge for the diaspora: how can we, using trade and investment, improve the relationship between the U.S. and Africa and grow wealth in Africa and in the U.S. So I will turn it over to the panel. To my left, Michael Sudakasa, Chief Executive Officer of the Africa Business Group. Janine had spoken about him in the beginning. Very strong experience. His bio is out here. And then we also have Felix Obi, who happens to also have the distinction of being a Nigerian like myself. And Felix is with the Maryland Governor's Office and chairs the Economic and Trade Development Task Force in the Office of the Governor of Maryland. So we have a very distinguished group of speakers, and we will look forward to listening to both of them talk to us. And after they have made statements and comments for about 10 minutes each, we will then open the floor. As much as possible, we would like an interactive session this morning. So welcome, and I will pass the microphone to Mr. Sudasaka, and Michael, and let's hear what you have to say. Welcome.
Good morning. And thank you, Professor Mahalu. Can I call you Kingsley?
Oh,
all right.
That's perfect.
For that, I think, very insightful setting the scene statement. I'd first like to say thank you to the Constituency for Africa for the invitation. I've participated in the Ron H. Brown series in years past, but it's been some time. And I'm very interested in the discussion of diaspora linkages with the continent. To Janine's point about our friendship, I mean, I used to live here in Washington, D.C., moved to South Africa for consultancy in '99, and have been living in South Africa since. A private sector development practitioner. I'm a commercial attorney by training. Perhaps unbeknownst to the CFA Brain Trust, you've stacked this panel with three people of Nigerian heritage. My father's from Nigeria, but I carry my mother's surname because I was born in New York, grew up in Michigan. But my interest in Africa was spurred by my heritage. And I spent my youth traveling back and forth between Michigan and parts of West Africa. And then as a young professional, went to Côte d'Ivoire to improve my French and found that the African Development Bank was there. And so I began my formal career at the African Development Bank in their private sector development unit. And my interest in the power of the private sector to promote development was spurred at that point. So I've spent most of my career trying to see how the private sector, both on the continent and the global private sector, can play a role in supporting Africa's development agenda. I'd like to open my remarks with a few points about how I see trade and investment between the U.S. and Africa, and particularly as it relates to the diaspora. Trade in Africa, to me, and I'm starting on the U.S. side and going in that direction, is really about investment. There's very few quick trade opportunities on the continent, and I think the U.S. and U.S.-based enterprises lose out on the trade opportunities that are there because they take a shorter-term vision of how they and when they want to get their returns. And from the vantage point of being on the continent, the market is getting a lot more competitive. I mean, you talked about the role of China, but there's India, there's Turkey, there's intra-African trade. A few years ago, South Africa as a country was the third largest investor as one country across the continent. Kenya is a major investor in East Africa, Nigeria a major investor in West Africa. And there are, although emerging, to be fair, manufacturing clusters in each of those three countries in particular that are competing with off-the-continent companies. So again, and when I was in Washington, D.C., I had a company not really dissimilar to Africa Business Group called 21st Century Africa, but the focus was providing counsel to U.S.-based companies who wanted to do business in Africa. And so I had companies like a company called Besser that made concrete brick machinery, and we went to South Africa in '94 to sell concrete brick machines when President Mandela was saying he was going to build 1 million homes, RDP homes, Reconstruction and Development Program homes, out of brick. Helped Domino's Pizza go to South Africa for the very first time and set itself up, and worked then with a company called Graymark at the time, which was an African-American asset finance company in Detroit, Michigan, that had the capital and the contacts with Domino's headquarters, which was based in Ann Arbor. So I've kind of watched different stakeholders try and do business on the continent. Worked with MillCare, which is a healthcare company that does all the components of any kind of medical facility MillCare can supply, but they do it in a way that the walls and infrastructure are not permanent. So if you have 4 walls, they can create an operating room, they can change it to a visiting room, they can change it to a radiology room. And so they also were looking at opportunities on the continent. And so one thing, again, that I would say is that the horizon has to be long-term when one is thinking about doing business in Africa, because the markets are changing. I often repeat the fact that in less now than 35 years, the population of the continent is supposed to double from roughly 1.2 billion to 2.4 billion. If you think about what happened to the U.S. economy when the baby boomers came of age and we had a big swell in population, put that on steroids, and that's what you'll have on the continent in terms of demand. You already see it in consumer goods, you see it in housing shortages, and there'll be pluses and minuses of that growth, but it creates a market, and the U.S. is not the only country around the world that sees that market. The other thing that I think is key and you spoke about AGOA. And AGOA, when I was here as a lawyer chairing the Africa Law Committee for the American Bar Association section on international law and practice, we were pushing for AGOA. And we all thought it would be a bit of a panacea. Great, this is a great opportunity. But as you pointed out, the stakeholders who were already exporting to the U.S. and importing natural resources just started using that to reduce the duties paid. But from a manufactured standpoint, we really didn't get a bump, didn't get a bonus from AGOA. And I wouldn't say do away with AGOA, but I feel like the window is closing potentially on AGOA. But that said, there's still a lot of opportunity. What I've seen in May at the World Economic Forum in Durban this year, I met a gentleman also from West Africa, but who was living in Minneapolis. And he was importing African foodstuffs. And as the market, the population of first generation, second generation Africans living in Minneapolis was growing, he had a thriving business supplying them with foodstuffs and even manufactured food that you can't get easily from Whole Foods, as an example. Definitely the potential for cut and sewed apparel has existed for a number of years. I mean, when I was living in Washington, D.C., the IFC was doing a study on, made in Africa, how can we take advantage of textile opportunities or cut and sew. The retail sector generally is growing phenomenally on the continent. But again, I talk about trade and investment. There's a lot of demand for these things there. And I don't know how well-placed diasporan enterprises are in the U.S. to really play a role in the cut and sew space. Maybe they're involved, but in my experience, that's not an area of significant penetration. In terms of remittances, I agree with you. There is a gentleman also of American and Guinean heritage named Eric Gishard, who created a vehicle called Home Strings and was trying to leverage diaspora capital remittances. And I think it's been challenging, to be fair. But the idea of diaspora bonds has been proven by Israel in grand context that comes to mind. But that's another area. But then you need, and this has always been my lament, I would say here in Washington we have a large community of Africa-interested diasporans. But arguably in New York is where you have people with the technical skills to do a lot of bond work. Are they engaged in this dialogue? Do they see a real return on investment for doing it, not because they're diasporans or of African descent, but because it makes money? Yeah. And until we put the proposition in that context, I'm not sure that we'll be able to do it, because if you're a development practitioner but you haven't done a bond deal, you will struggle through that process and you won't get the investment that you're looking for. But doing a mapping, I'll put it that way, of where the expertise is in the United States of people of African descent who are also interested in Africa. You have to be interested, otherwise, I don't think melanin alone makes for a good business proposition. Because on the continent, as it keeps evolving, that becomes your currency. Even for diasporans, I've met a number of diasporans who've moved back to different parts of the continent, and that's not always an easy road, because you left some time ago, your friends, your influence base is where you live now, and you're somehow displacing some people who may already be in that country's value chain. And they don't think you're going to stay long anyway, because there have been people who round trip. So that takes another investment of time and energy as a diasporan to say, I want to, and this is now first generation diasporan, African-born, moved, live in states, U.S. citizen, going back home. It's even harder if you're an African-American without that direct linkage. You really have to invest in the time, get to know the culture. And there's 54 cultures. There's similarities, but it's not a monolithic state. All of that said as pretext, let me just talk about where I do see some real clear opportunities that don't require heavy lifting. One of them is tourism. We were talking about my journey here and my colleague's journey when we came over from South Africa. Direct flights, multiple times a day, multiple airlines from Johannesburg to New York, Johannesburg to Washington, D.C., Johannesburg to Atlanta. Similarly, from West Africa, Senegal, Accra, Lagos, offer you, comparative ease of travel because, when I started traveling, it was Air Afrique or bust. And now there are many opportunities. And you see more and more. I mean, in South Africa, the largest number of ex-Africa visitors are from the United States. And so every one of those visits, because people are principally paying in a dollar-based currency, is a trade opportunity. It's a Forex earning opportunity. And so for diasporans to say, I'm going to organize 10 of my friends and we'll go to the Gambia, to Liberia, to Ghana, to Nigeria for a week, that's a trade opportunity. That didn't cost a lot, but that knowledge, and if it's for business, it's even better because now you leave with a contemporary view of what's going on the ground. That's the other thing that I feel like we don't get a good enough picture of. There's so much going on in the U.S., and I follow the news online and through television, that the news spent on contemporary African issues is minuscule. So there's an educational piece that is needed just to get on the ground and be informed, which is key. And again, tourism provides that. Tourism also, our moderator mentioned the importance of inclusive business development. It's an opportunity for young people to get engaged, and Africa has a huge youth bulge. Over 60% of the whole continent of the 1.2 billion are probably below the age of 25. So it's a very youthful continent, which is a plus if we can figure out how to manufacture competitively. But it's a threat if you talk about disaffected young people being able to be influenced from a political standpoint to destabilize countries. So there's a bit of a ticking there, some urgency, I'll put it that way, to engage young people, and tourism presents one of those opportunities. Services. I think increasingly on the continent, there's and it was mentioned by our moderator as well, a desire for capital. So if you come as a diasporan and you have tremendous knowledge but no capital, you'll sit with someone from the continent and you'll both be trying to figure out, well, where do we get the money from? And someone else will come with capital in hand. They may not have your intellect, but they have the capital. And so that becomes the partner. So that repeats itself quite often when you talk about diasporan continent relationships. But there is an opportunity in services trade. If you have skills, but you need a partner on that side who can leverage your skills into an existing business and now enhance the offering that they have. That's a win-win. That takes intellect without a lot of startup capital. Technical assistance. I don't see as much effort to do training outside of, I'll say, the development space, because obviously USAID and DFID and GIZ provide a lot of capital for development consultants to provide training. There are very few diasporan-led companies that I'm aware of. I mean, I've watched that for close to 25 years. It's the same companies doing a lot of business, and that's fine. But there are niches where there are opportunities, and I've watched this with medical doctors, for example, who go home and then they figure out what the needs are in the landscape, and they try and provide both the technical assistance and some of the equipment that's needed. August 5th, the NBA held their second NBA Africa game in Johannesburg. And Amadou Fall, who's the head of NBA Africa and a UDC graduate, talked about all of the linkages that some of the NBA players are trying, that are Africa-born, trying to do on the continent, including areas like agriculture. So there's one young man who's on, I think, Minnesota Timberwolves. He's playing basketball in the season, and then he's investing in a 150, 200 acre farm in Senegal. and providing capital, but also trying to leverage technical assistance that he can get in the U.S. to do that. Those are interesting opportunities that 20 years ago I didn't see as much of. Lastly, in the ICT space, I really wish that we could have gotten to town in time for the Monday session, because as a company, Africa Business Group focuses quite a bit on two sectors. Well, the third is the tourism that I mentioned, business tourism in particular, but also agriculture and renewable energy. I happened to attend the launch of Power Africa in Cape Town, and it's been a very exciting U.S.-led initiative, but we're still kind of making a drop in the bucket in terms of the demand for rural electrification in particular. Electrification in general. You cannot manufacture unless you have a low-cost access to electricity. But ICT increasingly is becoming ubiquitous with development on the continent, because it's smart agriculture, it's smart manufacturing. And you do have diasporans with engineering degrees affiliated with engineering institutions who could play a role. And it's a knowledge-based product at its end. There's a lot of focus on app development. And so there's another opportunity that I think exists. And I think I will stop there. I'm looking forward to the dialogue, because as I've come back and forth over the years, and now most of my kids are on this side in school or out of school, I see a renewed interest in the business nexus, but I don't think it's easy. So my closing thought would be, how do we also do this in clusters? In business, you always think of the lone ranger business person who does their thing and they're phenomenally successful by themselves. I don't see anybody succeeding on the continent like that. People do it with groups. I'm talking about the competing countries coming from elsewhere. When there's a political mission, they come with business people. When it's community or community opportunities, people come not so much in a cooperative, but an association of X comes and they fan out and they find opportunities and they share information and they try and support one another. A lot of times, business people coming from the U.S. come, and it's an eclectic group, so there's no cluster. You come and you spread out and you individually go and try and make something happen. And then when you get back, we were talking a bit earlier in the pause about the commercial service. I used to work very closely with the then foreign commercial service, but we've significantly reduced the number of commercial service officers on the continent and given them more countries to cover, et cetera. So obviously their efficacy is reduced. Very interested in hearing what my fellow panelists will say about what states are doing, because the states, to me, always, well, I'll say at the point when I was here, Michigan had a state office. I mean, there were a number of states who had offices focused on Africa. I don't know whether that's the case, but there's a significant budget. You talk about Chicago having a GDP the size of Africa. Well, Chicago could do by itself a lot if it wanted to, let alone the state of Illinois or other states. My family home state of Florida could do lots in Africa, and there are a number of Africans living there because of the tropical temperature from ag research, et cetera. There's a lot one could do. But starting with relationships, and I'll close with that, I think is what we need. You need somebody on that side who you know and trust, whether it's an investment or a trade, and you need somebody on this side. It's very difficult to start the whole thing from this side with strangers on that side and succeed. The opportunities for going astray are just too significant to overcome. But the benefit is that there are numbers of first generation Africans on this side who have close, long-time friends, and then they've got family there. But that's how I think one has to start, period. Otherwise, we've been having this conversation with the number of people in the room for much of the late 2000s and into the 21st century. And some of the same barriers are still there. Poised to change because this economy is improving. That creates a certain amount of wealth and risk opportunity. And Africa, we didn't talk as much about the policies, but the policies are improving. The politics are more stable. Obviously, we hear about the places that are on the bubble, but in large, there's a certain level of peace and prosperity that creates opportunity. So looking forward to talking with you all and hopefully working with you to develop that. That's always been my interest and passion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. I'm going to have Felix now give us his comments, and then when we come back, I will pick out some things from what both of them have said for further discussion. Felix.
Thank you very much. I am obviously in very good company, so I could just freeload a little bit and end up looking good. My name is Felix Obi, as you all know. I serve as Commissioner for African Affairs. I also chair the Governor's Economic and International Trade Development Task Force in the state of Maryland. And I'd like to think that in the truest sense, I'm an African American. I am Nigerian. I am as comfortable in any city, especially the capital cities in Africa, as I am on Capitol Hill. And I think that's really the very definition. I'm at once of Africa and at once a DC creature, good or bad. Prior to my position at the state of Maryland, I was with the Global Future of Development. Actually, I took a little bit of a break there, and I hope that I may be back there when I'm done with the state of Maryland. The Global Futures were a collaborative between Georgetown University and the World Bank Group. We'd like to think of ourselves as the teaching hospital of governance and development economics. Quite often, as the panel will know, and many of you know as well, there is this silo between, and I know there are lots of candidates from the Elliott School here. Quite often, you may soon realize that there is often a silo between new knowledge and practice. And we like to think at the Global Futures that we bridge that silo and we try to inject that new knowledge into practice, and we try to circle back to the scholarship end of the equation and let them know some of the things that are lost in translation. And the World Bank affords us that wonderful vehicle to put this new knowledge to test. I also happen to serve on the alumni board of Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy, and as well, as a true African American that I am, I also serve on the African American Advisory Board of Georgetown University. Prior to all this, I served an Economic and International Trade Development Fellowship with the Obama administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And it really allowed me a front row seat to work on FDI programs and initiatives into the United States, and also work on trade initiatives out of the United States, in particular for my portfolio into Africa. And beginning to look at how the competitive advantages are worked out, right? I worked on Select USA, and Select USA is a primary U.S. government vehicle to attract FDI into the United States. And in so doing, we work with all the states of the United States and indeed the outlying territories. On their competitive advantages, we work with states to set up regional economic development zones where the states craft interdependencies, similar to what you have in Silicon Valley. Because what tends to happen in the United States, and this is really instructive as we think about how Africa develops, it is instructive to look at others who are at head of Africa in the development curve and see how they've done it and what could be translated to the Africa side of the equation. So what we try to do is, quite often, you would hear, for instance, my county, Montgomery County, just announced that Fox News, the local Fox affiliate, will be moving their headquarters to Bethesda, Maryland. That's a big win for Montgomery County. The reality, though, is that I think they're moving from Washington, D.C. to Bethesda. So if you're a Marylander, as I am, it's a win. If you're the United States government, it's a loss. And here is why. The only reason, no, let me emphasize this again clearly. For Bethesda and for Maryland, it's a win. You're going to have folks move to Bethesda. They're going to occupy real estate. They're going to pay income taxes. They're going to consume. They're going to enroll their kids in school and after school activities. It's a win. But the only reason Fox would move from location X to Bethesda is because they got a better deal. That's it. And that better deal means net, for the public sector in the United States, it's a loss. The way to prevent this from happening is to create an interconnected economy, such as you have in Silicon Valley. So you would have Stanford, you have USC, and a number of other universities that are incubators, right, for the tech industry in the Silicon Valley region. And then you have MIT trying to, all the way from New England, trying to develop a pipeline. It would not matter what you would offer Google. They're not leaving Silicon Valley because there is an interconnected pipeline. The opposite happened to Boeing. When Boeing's union employees wanted a raise, Boeing moved some of its facility to a non-union state. For Boeing, that's a win. Net for the public sector, and I might argue for the union employees of Boeing, that's a loss. The only way to mitigate this is to figure out what the intrinsic competitive advantages of a region is. Build up those competitive advantages, build interconnections that make it difficult for businesses to relocate because price and cost is just not good enough. The same reason Wall Street is in New York isn't going to leave New York. The same reason London is fairly confident that with Brexit or not, a significant part of the finance industry and the banking industry will stay in London. This is what the United States does, and this is what it does very well when it really gets serious. On the trade side with Africa, and that's the other half of the equation, that's where, and you're going to hear a lot of we, and that gets to be confusing because we means the United States. We, for me, also means Africa. Yeah. So it gets a little confusing sometimes. But the place we've fallen short, I think, is in international trade. And because of two critical challenges, and it's important that we, the diasporans, and we, the Africa, understand this and then know how to better engage the United States. I believe we've fallen short in two critical areas. One is in trade financing. The second is in not recognizing that we're no longer price makers, we're price takers. The third actually is also political bias. We have a political philosophy in free markets. We believe that society functions best when the public sector creates opportunities for the private sector to thrive. That means you have regulation and you have access to capital. When you have regulation and you have access to capital, private sector can measure risk, sell their idea and risk assessment to capital, and capital can then decide how much rate of return it would insist on its loan. And that's in a broad strokes how our commercial sector functions. And we want to transpose this to Africa because it's worked for us. But here's the problem. We have competition in Africa, chiefly China. And China comes with a different philosophy. China believes that if you build it, they would come. They believe that the burden of development is on the state, not the public sector. So the Chinese will cut a deal with the state to build X, and the state will carry the burden of repayment. Here is the advantage. You have that project from inception to turnkey in record time. Here is the downside. The state carries the burden of repayment. But with the US model, And as you would find with Power Africa, as you interrogate Power Africa, we could go for 10 years discussing market reform, regulatory reform. And you must have this conversation and settle this conversation before private capital would even risk that investment. In the meantime, you have a lost generation of Africans. You have a lost opportunities. You have less commerce. But when it works, the burden of repayment will not be on the state and therefore the generations to come. It would be on the private sector. So is there a better model? When I wear the government hat, I will say to you, absolutely, the free market works. When I wear the citizen heart, I will say to you, the challenge is project execution and project selection. If you select properly, execute, you'll do just fine. But at some point, even as China is beginning to find, you'd have to begin to transition into a market-based economy, into a consumer-driven economy. But at Africa's level of development, the critical factor is project selection and project execution. Now, we could have a number of other conversations, and we could talk about AGOA, and we could talk about Power Africa, and we could talk about investments in infrastructure. And my colleagues have made very good points on this technical aspects of development and trade. But here's the critical factor. There is a reason why these deficits exist in Africa. And my concern is if these underlying reasons are not addressed, the project ultimately may not be as successful as imagined, as anticipated, if at all. Take, for instance, the railroad from Mombasa to Nairobi, Kenya. It has cut down transportation time and transportation cost to bring goods, well, as the Kenyan government would like to say, to bring finished products from Nairobi to the port of Mombasa. But the reverse is also true. It makes it quicker and cheaper to bring finished products from the port of Mombasa into the commercial and political capital of Nairobi. The same is true with Addis and Djibouti. You have quicker and cheaper rail link that is built by the Chinese, which, by the way, the United States isn't competing at all because our system doesn't allow us to compete. Because our system would insist that GE go out there, do a feasibility study, that GE go out there and insist to the local government about regulatory reform, tariff reform, so that GE can be guaranteed that it would earn a rate of return that is enough to satisfy that credit that it would secure. The Chinese don't operate that way. They would make a loan to the government, build the thing, and the government will bear the burden of repayment. Now, this is important, and this is the critical point that I'd like to make. There is a political settlement, and there is a political economy settlement that needs to occur in Africa for Africa to enjoy the benefit of these investments. If that doesn't happen, I fear the rail link from Mombasa to Nairobi, it would make it even cheaper to import flip-flops from China into Kenya, and thereby killing even the flip-flop manufacturing base in Kenya. If the political and political-economic settlement isn't had. So it would not be a win for Africa's manufacturing. It would be a win for any other person looking to export into Kenya. The same is true of every African country. Now, in Nigeria, for instance, Nigeria has signed a deal, I think about $5.6 billion for a new dam on the Benue River. This should be a good thing, and I suspect if executed properly, it will be a good thing. But here's the problem. There is a reason electricity deficits exist in Nigeria. If those challenges are not addressed, These are not issues of trade and investment. These are political settlements that need to be had. These are political economic conversations that need to be had. And that, it's not all of us here are into development economics. So essentially, here's what political economy means. You have to decide how you share the returns and the rewards of your economic engagement. You need to decide as a society how to integrate the various parts of your society, how to share those rewards. You need to decide what it means to be a citizen. What are the obligations that come with? And what are the benefits that should be accepted? If you don't have these conversations, if you don't have a conversation about what kind of political structure you want to have in the case of Nigeria, then it'll be very difficult to compete. And this is largely the problem of Africa. So on the one hand, the reason why AGOA doesn't work is because you have no electricity generation capacity in Africa. There is a gentleman in this crowd who's done significant work in Africa in agriculture in his other life. And he'll be the first to tell you that most of the harvest in Africa is lost because you can't refrigerate it. It would be difficult to build industry, to build out the value chain. In Nigeria, for instance, you have to estimate cost. You'd have to know what your electricity tariff is likely to be. But you can't because most times you're running backup diesel generator. Okay, so you base your cost on backup diesel generator. But you can't because sometimes there is none and you have to go to the black market and you can't estimate that cost. That cost is X. So how do you invest when your cost is X? How do you do that? You game the system. Simple. You game the system or you lose. So it wouldn't much matter what your intention is. If you want your business to survive, you'd have to game the system. Gaming the system doesn't mean you're doing anything really nefarious. It just means that you want to be sure that you can get diesel. That's it. That's all you want. So when you have these basic challenges, and again, there are political settlements that need to occur in Africa for these basic challenges to be overcome. It becomes increasingly difficult to export to the United States under AGOA. It becomes extremely difficult to create value chains. Nigeria is a net crude oil exporter, but it imports nearly all of our refined products. Petroleum, diesel, jet fuel. There's a problem, there's a reason why that deficit exists. And those reasons need to be addressed before you get into the investment. So I will say that despite all these challenges, I remain very bullish about Africa. And the reason why I'm bullish about Africa is because of Africans. Africans are some of the most passionate people about their homeland. Africa also has some of the most educated people in the world. And Africa has a growing youth population. The challenge for us, everyone in this room, everyone in the diaspora, everyone in leadership in Africa, the challenge for us is to educate this bulging youth population and create pathways, real honest pathways for people to have an opportunity to be able to maximize their potential. It's just that simple. And in the process of maximizing that potential, Africa will begin to realize what industry it needs to get into. Who could have proscribed Twitter 20 years ago? First time I heard about Twitter, I'm like, did someone tell them there is this thing called text message? But I thought it was a dumb idea, to be honest. But here we are, right? And that is because folks had an opportunity to get an education. That is because folks had an opportunity to be part of a system where they can maximize their potential. And that's essentially what Africa needs. If Africa doesn't do that, it'll be difficult for Africa to compete. On the United States side, we need to come to terms that we have a choice. Do we want to export an economic and political ideology, or do we want to win in economic engagement? That is the stark choice we have. But we are no longer price makers. We're price takers. Most times, Africa doesn't even really want to deal with the United States. And that's really honest. They would much rather deal. Actually, China doesn't consider us a competition anymore in Africa. Our competition in Africa is Israel, Pakistan, Lebanon, India. China's $5.6 billion dam project in Nigeria probably dwarfs the entire United States trade with Africa. And that's just one project. So it's delusional for us to think we're competing with China in Africa. We're not. So for those of us on the American side, we need to get into a dialogue with our members of Congress, have a real conversation about what it requires to win. I can confirm that a congressional Black caucus, especially Congresswoman Karen Bass, is passionately engaged in Africa. She was a passionate advocate for AGOA, as is the gentleman that's always going to be the dean of the African Congressional Caucus, no matter how long he's retired, former Congressman Randall. But now we've passed AGOA. Now it's about what does it take to make deals work. Solar panels are great, and that's mostly what Power Africa does. But if you want to run a cottage industry, solar panels work, and there is value in that. If you want a kid to have a light bulb instead of a paraffin lamp to do their homework, Power Africa works. But if you're thinking about macroeconomic development, if you're thinking about the kind of power that electricity generation requires, Power Africa is getting their lunch eaten. I know this because a colleague of mine from the World Bank, we got together and applied for a research grant with the China-Africa Research Institute at Hopkins University. And we interrogated the Power Africa investment model in Africa, and we interrogated versus the Chinese model. And we picked two countries, Ethiopia and Ghana. Two countries that we thought Ethiopia appears to be biased towards the state-led model, which will be somewhat similar to the Chinese model. And loosely speaking, Ghana is going the private sector route, free markets, which is loosely related to the United States. And we wanted to see if each model had an advantage based on their compatibility with the public policy in whichever country. And critically, what the locals think of the model. There was no competition. The locals wanted China. They preferred China. Ghana will do business with Power Africa, but that's only for deals that China isn't interested in because it's too small for China. And that's where we are. So on the US side, in closing, we need to realize we're not price makers. We need to engage our members of Congress and have Exim Bank empowered to be able to do deals that are just above $10 million, because that's a joke. Exim for a long time hasn't been able to finance any deal above $10 million because it doesn't have the quorum to approve deals that are above $10 million. And that is because of a political conflict. There are members of Congress who just believe that the public sector shouldn't have any role in private sector commerce. But we deal with an international community where our competition are not encumbered by such political, ideological buyers. If we're willing to stand fast and give up the economic returns that comes with, that's fine, but at least let's know that's the choice we're making. But then we should also then know that manufacturing in the United States, any hope that we have of revitalizing our manufacturing sector would be compromised. There is no reason why GE or American technology shouldn't be building the dams in Africa, or shouldn't be powering the locomotives in Africa. But that's just because of politics. So, on the African side, we better be sure these things work for us, that they don't become an efficient vehicle to bring in cheap imports and decimate our barely existent manufacturing capacity. So with that, I give the floor.
Good. Give it up. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I think, I'm glad I was here this morning. Listening to our two panelists. I think they've both highlighted very important issues. I like it when we come to these discussions, policy discussions, and we're going down deep into the things that really matter. Not spending our time on cliches about partnership, and that sort of thing. And I think our panel this morning has done justice to this topic. Michael started by talking about, setting the context for the competitive nature of trade and investment in Africa. They need to be long-term if you want to deal with Africa, not short-term. And he talked about, for example, the return on bonds. You have to think in commercial terms, not just sentiments. If you're talking about the role of the diaspora, you have to think about Africa as a business opportunity, win-win for both sides. So we have to frame our discussions more concretely when we're talking about diaspora engagement with Africa, and not just frame it on the sentiment of melanin and those types of things. I think that's very important. And he talked about the opportunities in tourism, in services, ICT, and so on. Felix has reminded us about the foundational issues that the Africa-US economic partnership must address on both sides of the divide. And he's made it very clear, if there was any doubt, that America and China are not in competition in Africa. It's a delusion. I love that term. If America sits here thinking, oh, we're competing with China in Africa, it's a joke. There is no competition going on. China is eating everyone's lunch. The Americans' lunch, the African lunch, the meals ready to eat. China is eating it all. So, we have to really wake up. On the African side, we have to have a conversation in our societies, and this brings me to a point I've been making in a lot of my interventions lately. The political and economic incompetence, the leadership incompetence of a lot of political leaders on the African continent. The absolute lack of intellectual depth in the thinking of a lot of African leaders, because you have to go down to this level that Felix has just talked about for African societies. What are our choices? How do we allocate risk and reward between the state and private citizens? Every man and their uncle, every woman and their aunt are now capitalists. But we haven't engaged in Africa what capitalism actually means for us. Only a few countries have undertaken an intellectual engagement with developmental models, and Ethiopia is one of them. Rwanda is another. I would say Botswana is another one, and maybe Mauritius is another one. Mauritius is going capitalist clear. Rwanda is mixed. Ethiopia is state-led development, and they're very clear. They're confident with. One of my private favorite reading materials I distribute to students at the Fletcher School at Tufts is a brilliant essay written by Meles Zenawi, the former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, arguing and holding his own as to why he's going the way he's going. It's such a brilliant essay. But time to open it up to the floor. And we will have questions and comments. And if you want to direct a question to a specific, please identify yourself and your affiliation. If you have a question for a specific panelist or if you're making a comment, please let us know. But please avoid giving us another lecture. Yeah, please. I know we have a lot of strong views, a lot of strong feelings about things. Keep it short, keep it sharp. Thank you.
Yes, Jonathan Weaver. I am the founder and president of the Pan-African Collective. For Felix, my neighbor there, we are based in Prince George's County. We'll talk about that later. But I'm also a pastor within the denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Professor Moghalu, I must say to the panel, this has been extremely insightful. I wrote down copious notes. But I wanted to say specifically this whole issue regarding real economic engagement. And also, I think the word was used by Michael about clusters. I think that there's some real opportunities here for both persons within the diaspora that are African Americans or persons like you, Felix, who born in Africa but now living in the United States, or parents and sons and daughters are now living in the United States. There are a number of organizations, and I would love to hear just the thinking of the panel in terms of organizations that are Black owned and operated, for example. I'll give you a couple of examples. One would be the National Association of Hotel Owners, Operators, and Developers. And these are African Americans who indeed own their own hotels, operating or developing them. But at this point, their market has been 99% the United States. But this would be a golden opportunity for them to learn. And they have an annual conference, and I can more than happy to give you the information about where they are and their executive director. It's about, I think, creating those partnerships in many instances because people aren't aware. They don't even know about possibilities. I'll give you another one. I'm also the chairman of the board for Industrial Bank right here in Washington, D.C., the only African-American owned bank in the Washington metropolitan area. It was talked about remittances. Most Black banks are not aware of those kinds of opportunities. Our president now does because of me. The first time I traveled to Africa was to Nigeria in 1971. And I've been back many times since then. But my point is that if Black banks learned about these opportunities so that the African community living, for example, in Washington, D.C., began to do business with Industrial Bank in terms of remittances, that Industrial Bank could grow to the point in which it's able to then turn around and make mortgages, other types of loans to Africans who own businesses here in the United States, in the Washington area, or elsewhere. And it's not just Industrial Bank, but at this point there's only 22 African-American owned banks in the entire United States. 30 years ago there were 85. But why? Because of the fact that we don't support one another. But here in the Washington metropolitan area, with over 200,000 plus Africans living in Washington, D.C., why not do business with an African-American owned bank that could support what they're trying to do? Michael, you talked about the opportunities, for example, in tourism. Again, I think that one of the ways in which we could work together, partnering, and again, I just wanted to kind of share that I think that we're missing something without utilizing the religious community. For example, the African Methodist Episcopal Church has 1.5 million members here in the United States, with structure that could be able to say to them, we want you to increase coming to Africa. Through the organization that I have now, the Pan-African Collective, we have created a relationship with Ethiopian Airlines so that they are now designated as the official airlines for the Pan-African Collective, so that we're encouraging people to utilize them. One last thing, and then I'll finish, because I just would like to hear your thinking about this kind of engagement. Professor, again, you talked about, for example, about products that come from Africa, but of course have not been processed, and you're absolutely correct, all of you. But one unique opportunity that emerged just about a year ago through the Pan-African Collective is talking to David Robinson. He is the son of Jackie Robinson, who played baseball. He's now living in Tanzania for the last 30 years. He has a relationship with 200 Tanzanian coffee growers, and they are now bringing Sweet Unity coffee through the pipeline of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, so that indeed those Tanzanian coffee growers are benefiting by having their product disseminated through the channel of distribution of AME churches, and therefore increasing and enhancing their own lifestyle. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities to take a look at, and I would welcome the opportunity to talk with all of you. And Felix, if you don't mind, perhaps you don't need to necessarily identify that person, but you mentioned earlier about someone who'd done a lot in terms of agricultural development in Africa. I would also say that persons need to think about solar energy as a way of making sure that those agricultural products go from the ground to get to port. And there's some ideas that I have for that person and for you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Weaver. Do the panelists want to comment at this point? Yeah? Okay. And then, two of you make comments, and then we will now take like 2-3 questions. We'll take the questions in bunches, and then rather than taking them singly. Yeah. Okay. Felix.
Obviously, we have to have a side conversation after this about Maryland. There is a gentleman who works at the Maryland Department of Commerce, Office of Africa, in the Department of International Trade. Great guy, very engaged, very focused, very aggressive. But he also works North America, so I think this week he's in Canada. So, but there are opportunities to get on international trade junkets in Africa. There are opportunities to sit in the United States booth, and when possible in the state of Maryland booth at international trade events. And there are opportunities for market survey. And just quickly, I would point out that what most of the big international chains are doing, and I know this because Marriott is in Montgomery County, is that they are selling their management expertise. So the state, in this case, subnational government in Nigeria, as an example, would build a hotel and then hire Marriott as a manager. And sometimes they'll slap their name on top of the hotel. So that's also a model that you want to look at. But, as I said, I would give you the contact details, and I would make a call to him, the gentleman that runs the Africa office at Commerce. And he understands the market, and there's a guy out of South Africa that, quarterbacks the entire thing, and he has offices in all the big economies in Africa, including Nigeria. As for the gentleman in agriculture, the problem with successful people is that they tend to move on to other things and be just as successful. So he's moved on to other bigger and better things, but I'm sure he still has friends over there, and I'll gauge their interest in having that conversation.
Thank you. Michael. Yeah.
Again, would welcome a sidebar. A couple of things that I want to say just about this process, and then I want to speak to your point. One, we're talking about Africa, 54 markets. I think we should be talking about 6, 7 markets where there, one, a lot of people from those countries living in the U.S., and then 2, there are fewer barriers to penetration. I know we've got colleagues who work quite closely with Angola, but when you step on the ground in Angola, Mozambique, if you don't speak Portuguese, barrier. If you step on the ground and you don't speak French, in 20-something countries, barrier. But you have Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, which is mentioned, Uganda, Tanzania, all Anglophone. And, well, that's just East. West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, and then Senegal, which is French-speaking, but there's a lot of Senegalese living in the U.S., so you've got a lot of people who can help change it. And in Southern Africa, South Africa, Zambia. Botswana was mentioned, very small. Mauritius is mentioned. It's really a finance hub. Zimbabwe, again, political challenges. But when Zimbabwe changes into a new political, Zimbabwe has to be on the list. They had everything. But when we talk about Africa in aggregate, I think that's a challenge for us. Your points about collective penetration. I mean, the AME Church, I don't think most people in the U.S., African American or otherwise, recognize the long history of the AME Church in Africa. That's like early 1900s. I'm a member of a fraternal organization founded in 1906. Before that, you had AME in South Africa. We have a chapter there, so we were doing homework. So it gives you, and there are African American members of the AME Church who serve across the continent because that's part of the structure of the AME Church. I remember Vashti was in Botswana, McKinsey. We don't take advantage of that, but we could. So, I'm very excited about the discussion you're having. The hotel owners. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at the African Hotel Investment Forum, which this year is going to be in Rwanda. It was in Ethiopia at that point. Because you have, real estate investment is a great, I didn't mention that, I should have mentioned that, for just individual investors. Great opportunity in Africa. Just, take a house, turn it into a 3-story, and then build up like Monopoly. A lot of African Americans and a lot of diasporans are doing that. That's part of the remittance investment on the continent. I'll have a home on the continent. So you have people in Ethiopia, a lot of America or ex-diaspora-based Ethiopians building. The government's creating a space for that. And so they're running hotels. Some of them are getting Marriott to help, but others would work with private hotel operators who can provide technical assistance, which I mentioned is needed. So there's an opportunity there. The solar piece, that's important. And again, a few years ago, we were project director for a solar energy technology roadmap exercise by the government of South Africa, Department of Energy, Department of Science and Technology. And we think small solar, pico lighting systems. But when you think solar farms and even medium-sized solar, 1 to 5 megawatts is you think of it small. But it lights a small town. So I'm not, in our thinking and work in solar, we're not talking about just lighting. We're talking about productive use solar. So now you're reducing post-harvest loss by allowing you to run a milling facility. Those are opportunities. We've worked in the past, 2010, we invited the American Association of Blacks in Energy to South Africa to try and get some of their members interested. I think, my experience, we have academicians on the dais. I used to teach at Georgetown's Business School before I moved to South Africa and continued to have relations with academic institutions. We need to know more about contemporary African economics, to the point that was mentioned by both of my colleagues. And that's a starting point for associations of whether it's church, it's social workers, it's lawyers. People come and they take a trip. I think that's helpful. But if you really wanted to create, churches do this, economic development corporations, for example, then being serious about having a 6-month, 12-month program with perhaps some of these colleagues or other colleagues who can bring the academia but also the practical to get you ready to do business on the continent. What is the legal regime? What is the, we haven't talked about the big C, which is always an issue in doing business in Africa, corruption. People want stuff now. There's delayed gratification is part of capitalism. You're kind of investing now and you'll get it later. Because there's still a belief in many countries that, political winds may change and the people who I know are out of office, I'm getting mine now. That leads to nefarious, I'll use that word, things to happen. But that's a barrier. We have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States. So how do you deal with all that? You have to know that going in. So that's the first, it's planning and to execute. It's not like the song Fools Rush In. You got to take the time. And we rarely, I feel like, do that homework and take the time. Somebody says there's going to be a trip next month, and I can go. I can afford $2,000. But the whole investment that you may need to be successful might be $20,000, $50,000. And you haven't done that calculation about how I'm going to get it and when I'm going to get a return. But if associations, organized capital, wanted to do that, it's fantastic. Lastly, the banks. I think it's the services. We're in a services economy in the United States. And I want the flexibility to go to California and be able to go to an ATM with no fees. And if Industrial Bank doesn't have that, I'm stuck. Now, in an internet space, we should be able to offer some things like that. And, you know, your point about our not investing with each other, I mean, that's legendary. But it definitely, if industrial bank, this is the point that I wanted to leave you with. In South Africa, we hosted a bank called KCB. That's a Kenyan bank. They were looking at opportunities in South Africa. So KCB organized a business of its clients, a business trip of its clients. And so its clients came to look at agriculture in South Africa, and then they went back. But if Industrial Bank, in addition to trying to court the Africans living in the Mid-Atlantic region, said, you know what, we would like to take our SME clients to look at opportunity, and we'll fund your growth as well. That's another angle that I haven't seen many commercial banks undertake, but that's happening, you know, on the continent kind of today. So, I mean, I definitely encourage the thinking. It's cheaper to go in a group. You know, a ticket that costs $2,000 to go to the States is not de minimis for an individual or a small and medium-sized company. The whole trip might cost $5,000. When you start talking about that and you talk about, okay, what I could do with that $5,000 locally, for most diasporans or even professionals, you know, and when I'm going to get a return. So if the AME Church or other organizations could say, look, for $2,500, you know, the travel, the rooms can be organized. We work with the German government on behalf of associations coming into Africa, organizing their inward bound trips. But the state, I mean, this is to your point, subsidizes that from Germany. But I don't see that the level, and at different times it is there, to your point about state of Maryland may be able to do this. But the state of Maryland.
We do, by the way.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that.
We subsidize
yeah.
trips.
So those are, but you package all of that, and then you have, to me, a greater likelihood of having a price point that's attractive from a business development standpoint. But then you need the education to let people know, but your return on investment of all of this may take you a few years. And then how do you, going back to the diaspora role, how do you use a young graduate? May never have been in Africa. We have a young lady who worked in our office from Ethiopia. Her parents are both Ethiopian, but she was born here, went to American University. She came out for 6 months, in and out, working with us as a consultant. Now she's moving back, and now she can help us carry on some of the business that we've done because she knows what we do, but she's based here. That's a model that could be replicated significantly because you've got young Ghanaians, Senegalese, everybody here in DC in particular. But they are also at a price point where they can go and be on the continent for 2 years, and it's an adventure. They're learning, they're happy. You take someone who is more senior, I need $60,000 because I've got a bond, I've got, you know, kids to pay for. I can't just go for the love of the game and be on the continent with all of the challenges. And I'm probably a little more rigid. I'm not going to spend the extra time to learn languages or to hang out with people to have them just become my friends and then help me figure out how that economy works. So those are some of the things that we could do that we haven't done consistently yet, because I think we talk big picture about trade and investment. On the east, the west coast of the country, where you have a lot of Asian people, whether it's Indian or from Japan, it's just personal. People just go back and forth, and they try and figure out if there's a little niche, and then they do that thing. So to me, it's to just do it. We've spent decades on the big picture plan, and corporate America is not struggling. To your point about losing, GE is in South Africa. GE is doing good business. There's probably 200 U.S. companies, and others keep coming. Particularly in the fast food industry, to South Africa as a place, and then they move around the continent. But SME business, which would include of any hue, it's difficult because it's a little more expensive. There's more competition. And what I found is that if you're a medium-sized company and part of your corporate leadership starts focusing on Africa, you may take the eye off the ball domestically. And you don't have the depth of human capital to do business in the States at the same tilt, and then send people over to Africa to do business. So then, again, you run into problems with your core clientele, and you have challenges. So all of these are kind of some of the things that a good strategy, all of our colleagues who work with schools, Georgetown, GW now have programs, Maryland have programs. Get some young people to do business planning and give you a 3-year strategy and implement that strategy as opposed to kind of feeling it. The ambassadors come to town, and then you move. So anyway, sorry about getting into it, but
that's all right.
obviously passionate about this subject.
Yeah. No, thank you. We will take about three questions. Yes, I mean, there are two people there. Sir, did you have a question? Okay, so we'll take two of you and one person at the back, and then we'll come back again. Yeah. And then for me briefly, because, yeah, I need to.
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting conversation here. I'm Odile Prévost, I'm French, and I run a charity in Cameroon for underprivileged kids. And I'm listening to you, and my first question to you, Michael. Language is not a barrier. Look at all the Chinese people who speak French in Cameroon. So language is not a barrier for me. So that was my first comment. And then when you talk about service and trade, you need a partner here and you need a partner there. Running a charity to find the right people on the spot in Cameroon, it's difficult. How do you get the right people on the continent when you want to run a business with the American standard? I ran into the African leader for Caterpillar, and he had a fantastic idea, and I joined him in his foundation. He has a platform for all the young people in Cameroon who wants to learn how to run a truck, and he does it through a computer. So they just need a computer, we forward them the computer, and they're fine. So what I'm saying is it's difficult to find the right partner, and they need a good education. And education is key for all my young kids who are going out of school and they have no jobs. So what do you say to these kids? Where do they need to go?
All right, my name is Marcus Kendrick. I work for ACOM International Development. And so this has actually been really interesting discussion. I was curious if maybe you could talk a bit more about what it means for a U.S. business to win in a win-win situation with Africa. A lot of the difficulties that have been discussed in doing business in Africa seem to me to really discourage the average U.S. business who doesn't have strong ties with Africa or the African diaspora from wanting to do business, unless it was from a development, like wanting to help, or as someone just mentioned, an affinity with, or an identity, common identity with the melanin in the skin. Yeah, I was really curious about how we could, or you propose U.S. companies going about this need to understand how to game the system in a non-nefarious way. I think, as you mentioned, like I've lived in Africa for 3 years, and it's like corruption or just needing to game the system is inherent if you want things to move forward. But then, as you mentioned, that Corrupt Practices Act exists, that we have to, watch ourselves. And then, so you also mentioned the need to engage our congresspersons, and I'm wondering to what degree, or precisely on what topics, we should engage them in order to promote that trade, that increased trade. That's it for now.
I'll take Lori, and then I'll come in.
Thank you. I'm Lori Fitzpagato, former Assistant Secretary of Commerce, disciple of Ron Brown, that this was named after. And just want to say a couple of things and ask for comment. I really appreciate the comment about political economic settlement. And I think that as people who want to do business in Africa, we need to be more engaged in the political side if we want to engage in trade and investment. There are issues that our own country has that we need to resolve. This is ALC week. We're going to be before many African American members of Congress, some of whom, with all due respect, don't grasp all of the political issues inherent in being able to trade with Africa. and are stuck in some of the traditional issues, which we understand there's a need in Africa for things to change and corruption and this, that, and all the stereotypes and all the realities. But there are things like double standards that are being applied, whether it's an election in Rwanda where 98% of the vote goes to the incumbent, or whether it's Angola where there's a transition of power to someone who's pretty much named by the incumbent. Whether we are dealing with a Kenya election that's been overturned because the voting, electronic voting machines and the paper ballots don't reconcile. So, you know, we're dealing with issues where there is a standard that is promoted that will prohibit us from doing trade because there are sanctions and sanction-like policies employed against countries because they haven't met human rights or electoral requirements that we have imposed, as is the case with the DRC. When we're talking about Power Africa, the biggest hydroelectric potential in the world is on the Congo River and the Inga Dam. Who's getting the contracts? The Chinese. Who's saying we can't bid on them? The United States. So the political economic resolution that needs to occur is on both sides of the ocean. And I think that as constituents, as people in the diaspora, that we have to also ask our own legislators and administration officials to do better in terms of opening up opportunities for us. I represent Sasol, which has the largest African investment, the largest investment, foreign investment in the United States of America. $9 billion in Louisiana, a South African company. Do you ever hear about that? That the largest investment in the U.S. is from an African company? So we have to, you know, ask about these things. And I would ask, what would you advise us as constituents in the U.S., most of us, I guess, Americans, to do in terms of our own legislators and our own administration officials under a Trump administration, where there is no national security advisor for Africa yet in place, where there is no permanent assistant secretary for Africa in place? What should we be doing to raise these issues and to level the playing field from a political and economic perspective in your political economic settlements, which I love? And thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
I think I'll let the panel.
Well, I think I'll start off, and thank you, Madam Assistant Secretary, for your very kind comment. I think, and I suspect, as you know, the great thing about the United States is that we have three co-equal branches of government. We have the judiciary, which is really a dispute settlement mechanism, and we have the legislative body, which makes regulations and controls the purse strings, and we have the executive branch. And when there is a vacuum of leadership in the executive branch, I think it provides an opportunity, a unique opportunity for the legislative branch to step up. I am very encouraged by the ranking member in the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Congresswoman Karen Bass. I find her to be passionate about Africa. I find her to be very engaged about Africa and with Africa. And to your point, part of what we have to do as entrepreneurs in African space is to then begin to offer suggestions on what that engagement ought to look like. And it goes to your point also slightly. I am hesitant to bring in the conversation about corruption in Africa when having a dialogue, because oftentimes it's painted to be synonymous or something particular with Africa. And it's not. There is a clear distinction between weak regulatory climate and the uncertainty and opportunity for rent seeking that can come with, and corruption. And one doesn't necessarily have something to do with the other. You could look at South Korea, for instance. There is strong regulation in South Korea. It's a high-tech manufacturing hub, both in hard manufacturing, automobile or technology, Samsung, LG, you name it, shipping. But it's a very corrupt country. But you don't tend to think of corruption when you think about South Korea. It takes 100 years to move any regulation forward in India. It is tied up in bureaucracy. That's how we frame the language, bureaucracy. We don't say it's corruption. But when it's Africa, the default is corruption. So yes, and this is not to say that corruption doesn't exist in Africa. It does exist. But just as in many other countries, we've had elections in the United States that have been disputed. We don't know to what extent our elections were manipulated. And this is just the last election. We can go back to Bush versus Gore in Florida. So disputed elections are also not anything unique to Africa. We are perhaps the most vibrant democracy in the world, and here we are. I suspect somewhere down the road, we might not be surprised to find that the Russians may have had something to do with Brexit. It wouldn't shock me. But yet, you wouldn't have these conversations about corrupt and questionable election outcomes when you discuss these other countries, the United States or Western countries or even Asian countries. So it is helpful to put it in context. That said, what is most important actually, I think, is not so much the system of governance. It is the presence of a system that is not centered around an individual. When you have my bias, I should preface it to say, is that I have a bias towards a democratic, plural democracy. I know it to work, I live in one, and that would be what I would recommend. But I've also seen the contrast between vibrant democracy in India and a control system in China, and both have huge populations, and I've seen that there are trade-offs. So I will say that the imperative for Africa is to pick a system that favors a system, not an individual. Because ultimately, when you bias a system towards an individual, it becomes about perpetuating that individual rather than maintaining the competitive advantages of that system. And that is the challenge I suspect and I fear Rwanda would run into in the next 5 years. And that has been the curse of Africa to the extent that there is one. It is that you want to maintain a system, not prop up an individual. When you have a system, there are stakeholders because there are people coming up the pipeline who want to see that system present economic returns long enough for them to get to come to power, right? So they have an interest in protecting that system. But when it's geared towards an individual, you cannot even have an ambition, at least not publicly, because it can't be allowed. That means your competition to the individual, your competition to the system, because the system is one person. So that will be the only concern that I have, that Africa begin to adopt a system and stick to that system to the extent that that system is based on a system, not an individual. If I had to pick a side, vibrant democracy can be messy, but you know what? It tends to last. So to our leadership in Congress and to the extent that the executive side of the government will listen, it is about really trade financing. It is about getting beyond the headlines and the slapstick definitions about Africa and really getting to know Africa. It's about basic curiosity. More substantively, and to your point, I know in the state of Maryland that we have an Office of Africa. I know in the state of Maryland, our Office of Africa is able to vet through U.S. embassies and through U.S. commercial service, vet industries and vet individuals. After a while, they will begin to impose a cost, but you'd have to be a Maryland-based business. I suspect the same is true for most states that are interested in the export markets. Maryland will subsidize, for instance, the cost of an overseas business trip up to $5,000. And I'm sure there are guidelines that you'd have to meet to qualify. So but you have to have a strong idea about what products you have, or you have to have a curiosity to know what the market looks like. But there are people in agencies, in state agencies that can help with that relationship. On the Africa side, and to your point, we have to have a skilled population. Nigeria, for instance, likes to say that it's a market of 190 million people. And it is true. But active participants in the economy are perhaps 40 million. Because you'd have to have skills, and you have to be able to consume or contribute. If you don't have skills, and you don't have the capacity to consume, which is income or credit, then you're not really a bystander, right? So it is also about transferring some of what we know has worked here as diasporans to the continent. It's also about strengthening the education system and supporting governments and NGOs that work to educate the population. Part of the reason we're in this room is education. I know that's why I'm here. So it's worked for me, it's worked for all of us. But really, it's being engaged, it's about going beyond the headlines. And it's about strengthening U.S.-Africa business. And it's about financing. That's really what it comes down to. You don't have access to capital, you're just talking. And so if we can get the Congressional Black Caucus to bring to the agenda, our congressional agenda, better funding from the Exim Bank, that's a win. I don't know that the U.S.-Africa Business Summit is going to go on with this administration. It's possible. There is not yet a coherent African policy, but we'll see what happens. And that's the prerogative of the executive branch. We'll see.
I'm going to start with the three questions posed and extrapolate a bit. My comment that French or language is a barrier, you're right. I think it's not necessarily a barrier. But then you have to take a long view of doing business in the market. So the Chinese who learn French or Portuguese move to those countries and they live there for a long time. It becomes, I have to speak the language to do business, even if my business is trade. But I'm going to be here, my cousin or other party is in China, but I'm the person on the ground who's doing long-term business development. They not only learn French, they may learn Wolof or whatever other language, Afrikaans, to be at home. I haven't seen that level of commitment from U.S. businesses, again, particularly small and medium-sized businesses. Bigger corporates can hire that expertise. So, the way to get around it to me is young people are the future. I should have prefaced this with the whole thing. This is a 21st century discussion, and we're talking mid-21st century. I mean, many of us, we're building the bridge, but we may not, like Moses, get to the other side. But young people, and that's the panel that's coming up this afternoon, can run through this whole thing, and that's where our focus should be. So a young intern, again, we're in a college town. We don't think of it that way, but there's probably 10 different academic institutions in town where there are young people who could be interested in Africa, because we have the U.S. government apparatus for Africa, we've got the World Bank apparatus for Africa, and we've got all the embassies. So you can get more education about Africa in this city, I think, than any place else in the country, maybe New York. So how do you take some of those young people, have them work for an organization like yours in a summer? The university will fund some of this. A church will fund some of this. Parents will pay for that because it's part of an educational process. There you make contacts, you get friends. 2, you learn language. 3, you learn business mores, culture, etc. Now when you graduate, they're useful to an organization like yours right out of the month. Now if you're on the other side, and you're talking about how do you work with young Africans to find partners, it kind of works reverse, except if you have visa issues, you bring some of those young people in those formative years to the U.S. Yali.
Oh, but they don't want to go back.
Some don't. I mean, I think that's a misconception that every African who comes to the U.S. wants to stay in the U.S. In many cases, you cannot. And so everybody doesn't become a refugee or a fugitive from justice. People do go back. I meet them. So I think we shoot ourselves in the foot if we're just going to lead with they'll come to America and not go back. Because there are many things that happen in the U.S. that push foreigners out, particularly African descent. So you want a strategy, try it, and if you've tried it, and you got to keep working it. That's what I'm saying. This is a long-term process. But if you could take a young African, bring him to the U.S. I use Yali. I don't think the Yali people they're not going to school necessarily. They come over, they get exposed, they get contacts, they go back home, and then they can work. Now, again, if it's across the board, I guess you have to start thinking to the point of your neighbor, what is a win? A win takes time. If we set ourselves up that we can't win, then we should just give it to China or India. There are many other countries, but China kind of is the one really, right now winning. But the platform of technology, there's a lot of engagement now that can happen with social media that was just impossible in the past. And there are a lot of young people. I had my alma mater for undergrad is the University of Michigan. There's a young man who introduced me to another young alumni from Michigan. They're busy trying to scout from a tourism standpoint opportunities in Africa. Where should you go if you go to Africa? It's an app. And these are millennials. That's an opportunity. It's been an opportunity. It'll get other young people to, when you get off, some of the tools that you use to go to Paris may not exist for parts of Africa. They're trying to fill in that gap. I think that's very much an opportunity for someone to do. ICOM has, in the last 10 years, I don't know how old the company is, but they made a big splash in South Africa, for example. You still get, and we don't talk about this as much, the highest returns of investment, foreign direct investment in Africa, maybe commensurate with the risk, but it's over 30%. So the win for those companies who do go, it's kind of, it's an acronym, my alma mater, those who stay will be champions. Those who stay are making money. So the win is that. I mean, I talked about the 200 plus US companies in South Africa, but they use South Africa as a branch, and then they kind of find their way into other markets. They use Kenya also as a launch pad, and then they find their way in other places. One of the partners in this year's, or sponsors, I guess, of this year's program is involved in helping people franchise. We haven't talked really about franchising, but franchising is a great way to do business in Africa because you take your African model, you license it, or you take your American model, you license it in Africa, and then African SMEs do the business, send you royalties. So you're making money with the system you developed here, there. And so that's another way, I think, for us to win here. On the political economic settlements, it takes a long time. And I think what most politicians ask globally is, what does any of this mean for my constituents? Why does Africa matter? Period. Whether you're a CBC member or a non-CBC member. And, there's a group here in DC, and many people know Mima Nedeljkovic, he heads IGD. They have an initiative called Making Farming Cool. And I wanted to borrow from that and say, how do you make Africa cool? For many people of African descent and just general Americans, Africa is not cool. It's where there's wars, blah, blah. This is and again, I come back and forth. My kids are here, my mother's here. I consider myself as a counterpart. This is a digression, but I'm an American African. I was born African American, raised African American culture. I've lived in Africa now for almost 20 years. So it's a flip side of that coin. But how do you promote? So for me, we don't really use our media well. I was thinking about Oprah TV. I was thinking about TV One. I was thinking about allafrica.com. These are all sources of not only information, but potentially promotion. And I just don't see a lot of our promoting institutions like SASL. But there are many others. Every year there's magazines who produce top 100, top 200 African companies, and we all may know Dangote from Nigeria, but there are many other multi-million-dollar companies in Africa that I don't know we invite to invest in America. That's the other flip side of this, is to say, what is the value of a presence in America? China has been investing consistently in America, and India invests when they have the people who have the capital in America. So if I'm an African company and I want to use AGOA, Why not invest in America? For the skill sets, for the knowledge, for all the reasons people go to Silicon Valley, there are other pockets of excellence around the U.S. where if I was in agriculture and I wanted to learn kind of the cutting edge processing, why wouldn't I go to somewhere in the Midwest and invest? But I don't hear from people who are interested in Africa's development or people who would like to see greater linkages. We should have that discussion as well, because if investment came from Africa into a district in somewhere in America, it's now of relevance to the congresspeople, to the mayor, to the citizens of that community. And now you have a lobby constituency. We just haven't had, to me, a galvanized constituency to tell our politicians, besides all the historical issues, why Africa should matter, why Africa matters today. And to me, that's a point. CFA used to do, and I still think does, town hall meetings. But at the end of the day, why does it matter? Is the thing that a local politician, is anybody paying taxes related to this enterprise that you'd like me to do? If it's the church and we go and we're going to start a business in Africa and now it's going to enrich us here in America while we're doing business there, that has relevance. And I've, again, as a lawyer, I've studied this, history major, I've focused on it commercially in practice. As an economic development practitioner, I've watched this, and I don't think kind of a lesson until we'll really be able to galvanize the political power that we could have until we address that issue of, one, putting Africa in a better light or a more holistic light. I won't say a better light, because all the challenges I've talked about that we've mentioned, they're there. But to your point about, corruption, we could wax, rhetorically here about different issues that people want to issue spot or other parts of the world. But so we shouldn't have Africa as a broad brush, but we don't see Africa outside of that light. Films don't really cover Africa in a holistic, contemporary manner. Artists, there's a company I just want to end with, Africa Creative Agencies, a classmate of mine, they're based out in LA. They've opened office in Johannesburg. They're representing artists. They were at the NBA game I was talking about, pitching something to LeBron James to say why they want to represent his brand in Africa. That's cool. Jadana, who's going to be here later, he may talk about that. But how do we resonate a little bit more with general communities in the U.S. of color and non to say Africa is a very dynamic continent, and there are particularly, let's say, 10 countries. Like, if we can narrow down, these are our 10 countries of focus, and we really want to see American interests grow there. But when we talk about Africa with the 54, as much as you may talk about Nigeria's potential, South Africa's potential, somebody's going to say, what about South Sudan? And then we're off the rails, because you don't really have an answer about some of the countries that are struggling. But if we could narrow it and do specific things, and leverage the populations, I've said it in the CFA 4 before. African Americans, we're struggling with that engagement with continental-born Africans. And there's now big populations of continental-born Africans in Atlanta, Minnesota, Los Angeles, Chicago, here in DC, doing their own thing. How could you give them some tricks of the trade in terms of manipulating politics, and not manipulating in a negative way, accessing the political machinery in a positive way? Because African Americans have been working on this for a long time. But I don't know, I'd be interested to see if the organization you're talking about in Montgomery County is trying to do some of this. But again, unless you can do that, they have capital. Many of them come over here, get higher education, great degrees, millionaires in American terms. But I don't know that they're aggressively contributing to the discussions that we're having. They just say, I'm going to go home and build something or do something. Please add to
I just want to make a very quick point, and I'll be really brief. Part of branding Africa is also to stop the phobia about Africa, right? About Africans won't come back, right? Talented people go all over the world. You're in Cameroon. Nobody's asking you in Cameroon, would you go back? So that's what talent does. Talent goes where it wants to go. There's a gentleman in the crowd, Joseph. He's probably going to be pissed off at me for identifying him. I will, because it's important to begin to put a face to what Africa looks like. Joseph, until recently was a senior foreign and commercial service officer for USDA. Joseph has probably put together over $1 billion for the United States government in deals and United States businesses. He's cycled out of the government. He's in Africa running a youth and education and basketball program in Africa. So Africans do create value where they go, and yes, Africans do go back. He's in Africa. And guess what? He's living a better life in Africa than I am in Montgomery County. How's that? So I'm about to ask him for a job. That's Africa. So it's important that we remove the phobia. Talent is all over the world. Part of the challenge of the world is that there is a globalization of goods and services, but not labor. And it creates huge disparities. And to the extent we can begin to balance out those disparities, you would find out that the world would be a lot more stable. But it's important that we know Africa, and a lot of us in this room are Africans, and I like to think that net we're contributors, and net we go where fortune takes us, and passion. And who knows, I might end up in India, I don't know. But that's the global future for you. In the same way Chinese are in Africa, why can Africans be anywhere they think that talent can take them to? So.
Hello, my name is Dr. Malcolm Beach. I'm with an organization called the African Business League, and our members are business people in America that want to do business in Africa, and African businesses that want to do business with these Americans in Africa. Primarily a single question here. The American businesses want to know how can they get guaranteed payment for the work that they do in Africa. In particular, the industry I'm talking about is housing construction. In other words, we've got requests from various housing ministries to build houses for them. 10,000 houses, a lot of money. How do we guarantee payment? Finance minister, African Development Bank, who will guarantee the payment? Because the individual countries' Standard & Poor's rating is only B, and Wall Street wants triple B or triple A for guarantees.
My name is Alan Herman. I'm an African-born, educated person who now lives in America in Montgomery County. My question is, we skipped around education, but it's the central theme of good partnership. You have to educate or build your partner so that they can talk the same language that you can. And to answer one of the other questions about, they all go back to America, I went back to Africa and spent 8 years there producing my replicants. I actually graduated 600 people as Masters of Public Health. So I've done my due diligence. I live here, but I've got 600 people who are like me doing the work in Africa. But we never ask a German, are you going to go back to Germany? We never ask an English woman, are you going to go back to England? We only ask the Africans, as if there's something that is different about us. And I think we ought to stop this nonsense.
Hi, everyone. I'll keep my comment short. It's Millennial speaking. My name is Victoria Gregg, and I'm the executive producer of Akata documentary. And this documentary traces my journey to discovering my African roots. And one of my main objectives is to make Africa cool to African Americans. In fact, my two hashtags are #MoreThanBlack to get African Americans to start identifying as African. And my second hashtag is genealogy is lit, meaning cool. So I'm trying to, there we go. So I'm actually currently fundraising to get funds to go back to West Africa, and through this film, everybody will see me and my team having a great time in Africa. So my quick question to Felix is, you had mentioned the Office of African Affairs in Maryland. I'm also a Montgomery County resident. So I would like to, and you guys you said that they subsidize trips to Africa, and my documentary is a registered business in the state of Maryland. Is that organization, would they sponsor something or help me, complete my film in Africa? Thank you.
My name is Bijou Koulibaly. I was born and raised in Mali. Plan to go back to Africa. I'm currently doing my MA in International Trade and Policy, and I live here in DC. My question is on the Power Africa initiative. As we know, electricity, over 80% of the African population don't have any access to electricity, and electricity consumption in Africa is generally used for industrial activities such as mining and refining. So with this Power Africa initiative, my question is, how can the U.S. government approach local communities as true partners and explore ways for them to have more ownership over the process and the implementation of projects? Because I believe that the people are the ones mostly left out of the electricity generation in Africa. I went through the Power Initiative, Power Africa Initiative on the U.S. government website, and I saw that there are ways to do that, but it looks like it is not the way that they're approaching it right now. So I was just asking that question. I need more clearance in it. Thank you.
And may I put one fact in its correct version? When the British helped, I am an Ethiopian and my name is Asaf Seifu, help us to get rid of the Italians for their own need, because I won't go into it. One of the things that they wanted to impose upon us was the language. Anglophone. The emperor and his government said, no. We have a language, we have alphabet. So we're not Anglophones in that description. Secondly, what they wanted to impose upon us was our currency's affiliation with either the dollar or the pound. And the emperor said, you base your economy on gold. Why base our economy on those that depend on gold when we have gold ourselves? He refused. And at that time we were referred to occupied enemy territory, not even as Ethiopia. Now, the gentleman who left us spoke highly of Mellis. When he died, the BBC World Service called me and asked me if I wanted to comment. And I said, of course. I said, Mellis was a devil incarnate, an evil genius. That he was intelligent is not disputable. That he was not an Ethiopian in so much as he respected both the history, the present, and the future of Ethiopians needs no elaboration. But look at the ethnic division of the country that has embroiled the country in warfare and displacement of people for a long time to go. So it was with a far sight that Isaias Afwerki said, we leave you with 100 years of headache. That put aside, let me put a general question. Why do you think the West left China to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner of Africa, beautifully put? Why do you think so? I would like an answer. Lastly, the deputy secretary mentioned Angola and said 98%. May I remind her that Ethiopia was wouldn't be beaten even there. 100% in our case. That was during the days of the Soviet era, and the previous president of this great country, a beneficiary of Ethiopianism, because it was Ethiopianism that got rid of the colonialism. The highest beneficiary of that Ethiopianism and his close assistants wanted to destroy Ethiopia. Finally, why do you, so talented, so educated, so gifted Africans with such valuable voice and knowledge, not serve your countries and are here, where there is abundance of your talents, the talents at your country? Thank you very much.
Thanks. This is a final and a very quick question. I actually wear a couple of hats, 25 years with the Oracle Corporation, ICT, plus a graduate of Georgetown University in leadership, my alumnus. Thank you. Really nice discussion. My very, very focused and quick question. I'm in the process of trying to understand, by the way, I do come from an Afro culture, growing up and raised in Georgetown, Guyana, born there. My question is building a transformational leadership to educate the youth in Africa, because that's my focus. With the influx of Chinese, as it is happening today, what is just a general broad brush impact in the panel's view? And is it just a labor, is it just a capital investment, or is it more of a migration of labor, and the scale is large enough that I need to factor that in this model that I'm trying to put together? Thank you very much.
I think I'll begin with the Africa trip because that's the easier of the above. I know the trip has to be a commercial enterprise, and I suspect there would be a technical definition of what qualifies. What I'm willing to do is to pass on the contact details, and then you can work out what those technical qualifiers would be. But realize that it's not a free trip, it's a subsidy up to $5,000. 50% of the cost up to $5,000 is the subsidy. The other question is about Power Africa and local content, and or engaging local partners. Again, it goes back to building the capacity of the host nation, and I think there is also a question of sovereignty that you don't want to give up. I don't think you want the United States government working with local partners to determine how you develop a country. That's something you want. You want to hold your government accountable, and you want to have and that goes to the whole point about project execution. There has to be a deliberate reason why you prioritize projects, and it has to be part of a broader development strategy. And it is best homegrown. The interest of any country in dealing with a different country is profits. Now, for a country that is a global leader such as the United States, we have broader interests such as stability, because we want the system to hold, because the system is beneficial, and we are a key architect to the system. So we have broader interests. Ours is not such as narrow as the Chinese would be. But make no mistake about it, it's a commercial engagement. And what you would want to have to be the most successful is to have a government that has a deliberate national economic development policy. And that national economic development policy would then prioritize projects, infrastructure projects. And then you can begin to see who is best situated to execute this project for the national economy. In some cases, it will be Power Africa. In some cases, other governments may be better suited, or other private enterprise. What is the next question? Why do you think West Africa left? Why do we think the West has left Africa to China? I'm not sure that the West left Africa to China. China is competing. China is competing, and that's a page we need to borrow as Africans. Nobody's relinquishing anything to China. Why did the West isn't relinquishing our manufacturing sector to China, but here we are. So we need to compete. China is not getting any free ride. Now, there are free riders, but they're not getting a free ride. There are free riders, for instance. There is a reason why trade flourishes. The United States has naval forces from the Sea of Japan through the South China Sea, through the Straits of Hormuz. And the reason we have this naval presence is that it protects shipping lanes. It costs money. It costs the United States government taxpayers money to protect the Straits of Hormuz so oil and gas can flow out of the Middle East, to protect the South China Sea so finished products can flow. The Chinese are challenging the norms. They're building up Senkaku Islands. They're building up military forces and expanding their territorial claims. This is a challenge to the system, to the norm that has created the prosperity that especially Western countries have benefited from, and of which China is the preeminent beneficiary at this point in history. They do not contribute to this global order. The taxpayers do not contribute to it, and they benefit from it, and they are at the same time challenging it. And at the same time, they want to be welcomed into the Bretton Woods institutions, as I think they should, by the way. But I think China has to reconcile the fact that with that welcome would come responsibilities. With that welcome would come with expectations that it plays by global norms. You can't challenge a system and at the same time also want to be part of the system. It doesn't quite work that way. But more broadly, that's the broad brush. Nobody's giving China anything. China is competing, but is also getting a free ride. Why do I not serve Africa? Very good question. Perhaps I should have started by saying that I also, for a point in my life, managed the Nigeria-South Africa Binational Commission, which is a bilateral group that includes cultural, trade, and social engagement between the two largest economies in Africa. And if you carry that water even for a day, I think you've done your bit. And I did that for a few years. Now, that does not mean that I've given up any chances of working with Africa. Indeed, my job with the state of Maryland is to increase trade engagement, to increase cultural engagement, and to facilitate that process with Africa. So I think the location is not so much the issue. The issue is the passion, and that you're an ambassador of the continent, and that you carry yourself with dignity, and that you create value in your actions and in your words and your deeds. That Africa is, what's the cool word for Africa again? Africa is lit. So that's really the challenge. What the gentleman that is asking the impact of China in Africa? From a population point of view, the simple answer, depends. Depends on the government. That is the gift and the curse of dealing with China. Every other country, as I mentioned, plays by norms, established norms that has guided the largest economic expansion that the world has witnessed, and this is post-World War II. In the West, this means there are standards of behavior. This means, for instance, we worry about things like immigration, and we worry about things about manufacturing standards. The Chinese largely would give you whatever you want. You want a standard that is world-class, the Chinese will give it to you. You want substandard product that would also cause electrical fires up and down the economy, the Chinese will give you that too. So how much immigration you get out of China depends. If you want to build a railroad, you can negotiate the level of local content. How empowered is the local government in negotiating these deals? That's the determinant. So there isn't going to be a uniform outcome. I suspect the Chinese will not play a critical role in Nigeria in terms of impacting the population as it has in Senegal, where the Chinese are displacing local shoe industry that has been around for centuries. the Senegalese now import shoes from Chinese. The Chinese look at Senegalese-made shoes, they take it back to China, they copy it, and they bring it back. And now there is tension. Nigerians are a little bit more aggressive for that, so it will be a bigger challenge. So again, it depends. And I recently had a conversation in the last 2 weeks, and I'll close with this, with one of the candidates in the Liberian presidential election that is going to happen very quickly, Miss Magdala Cooper. And one of the things she mentioned is that trade negotiations in Africa and international engagements in Africa is typically, unfortunately, negotiated from the office of the presidency, rather than the institution that has the statutory responsibility to negotiate those deals. The unfortunate thing is that it becomes about personality and you don't build institutional knowledge. So perhaps the other way to go around it also is one of the ways to begin to create standardization is to begin to allow those institutions that have the statutory responsibility to negotiate these engagements to drive trade negotiations rather than the presidency. And that's really, and she said, to be fair, that this is not so much an issue with Liberia necessarily, but with Africa as a whole. Because when this happens, you don't build institutional capacity. And it also creates this rule that institutions are negotiable, that roles are negotiable, norms are negotiable, and that's not healthy for the long run.
I want to start my response to the query about construction guarantees. I think there's the African Guarantee Fund. I'll just give you that institution, which is based in Kenya, which was founded by the African Development Bank, that might look at a transaction like that. I don't know, as American-based companies who are looking to Africa, how much they try and work with local companies in the industry of construction. I think it's difficult to get involved with construction if you don't have a local partner or you don't have a local foot, and then you want that investment protected. The African Development Bank does provide that. They're an infrastructure bank. The World Bank is an infrastructure bank. So there's MEGA as well, protecting you from political risk. In terms of economic risk, you probably have to have more of a vested exercise there. And if it's just you're looking for housing from government, or you're providing housing to government, that may be a trickier one. I'm just being candid with you. Because I've seen, I mean, there's a demand, but guaranteeing payment, you might, if you, and again, the companies that succeed, they're often, I'll use China. They have the risk capital to be able to build the first homes, have people move into them, start paying rent or buying them, and they almost self-insure. They do it in stages and they get their money back. They don't build 10,000 at risk. And if you're waiting for government to cover all that risk, again, that can be a tricky proposition. The comment about education, I mean, I think there's more people doing what you've done than we give credit for. So that's where media and chronicling investment by Africans in Africa who living in the U.S., we underdo that. We don't give credit for all the diasporans who come here, get skills, business, etc., go back to the continent, whether they go to their home country or they go to other countries and contribute. But they've made a life here. Who does that? Why would you have to go if you can make a life here? That's what the American dream is about. Watching the movie on the way over here called Gifted. If anybody's seen it. It's a white American movie. But the guy who's in it, whose daughter is gifted, his mother's from the UK, to your point. And he's American. She speaks with a British accent. And she lives in America. Nobody talks about it. That's America. So when we have that with Africans, it's like, but those Africans should have all gone back. And that doesn't make sense. It's not that's not the U.S. The film that the young lady would like to do, the documentary, I'll leave that to you. But what I will say is that, again, there's a growing interest in capturing, in a digital age, stories about Africa. And there are resources to do that. the colleagues that I mentioned to you who are out in California, I'd try and put you in touch with, because they're in the film capital of the country. And there are many Africans, I mean, we know of them, who are working now in Hollywood. The cost of your documentary, I don't know what it would be, but there are people who have the resource to say, almost as corporate social responsibility, let me help you with that film. And I know the young man who I mentioned, who's my classmate, has an interest in the genealogy discussion, because it helps you, again, we talk about Africa as a polyglot, but it's 54 countries with their own histories, et cetera, and ethnic groups, et cetera. So if you could kind of place yourself in Africa, I think it's self-gratifying exercise. I'm trying to do things in this country because my forebears were from here. That's kind of how the world works. So to just say I'm African American and I want to do something in Africa, when you get to the continent, people are like, but you're not my cousin, And you might be, but if you have no, those are some of the issues that are real in terms of diaspora discussion. I agree with my colleague that I don't think we've ceded anything to China. I think it started, if people recognize, for 10 years, China was the leading purchaser of natural resources from Africa. It was buying, and that curried favor. When China was booming, it needed natural resources. It went to the continent, it bought like everything. So when the European Union was talking about, EPAs, economic partnership agreements, and they were crafting their own regional economic communities, irrespective of what the African Union said, China said, nah, you don't have to do any of that with me, for better or for worse. But then they just bought. And so then, once you're buying, it's okay, what can I sell? And African countries opened the doors. Now, some of them, are closing those doors and saying, look, we don't want to be inundated with cheap Chinese-made products, or have you in industries that our people can do. And that is the pushback that you see every day. But I travel around Africa, and what I appreciate is that there's highways where there weren't highways, in particular the infrastructure piece. And, again, have worked with USAID, watched USAID, we don't build highways. But you need highways. If you got agriculture, one of the reasons why stuff spoils before it gets to market is you can't get it there fast enough. When the rainy season comes, there's an impassable road. And China will come in and build you a bridge. So, if we wanted to play in the space, and they don't need a TDA grant to do that beforehand and then tie it, they just build it. So that's the kind of reflection of the market, and that's why I was going back to, in 33 years, which is not a long time, 1.2 to 2.4 billion people. It'll be bigger than China, bigger than India, the continent. Still disaggregated, in my opinion. It won't necessarily be one Africa, but that's a huge market. China is, from an economic growth standpoint, pricing itself out of cheap manufacturing in China. The middle class there doesn't want to do what it used to do. So Chinese are moving to Ethiopia as one country, and the state is inviting them, but they're moving, creating economic zones to manufacture. Same stuff they were manufacturing in China, they're using Ethiopian labor to sell globally. I grew up in Michigan. When all those car parts went from Detroit to China, why can't they come to Senegal or Ethiopia or South Africa? Some of them are in South Africa. But thinking in those spaces about where you've got low cost labor, but you need energy. So it's going to shift me to the Power Africa discussion. I've watched Power Africa as a facilitating mechanism. Honestly, I haven't seen a lot of deals. But you asked us, and I don't think any of us represent Power Africa. You kind of ask the Power Africa people when they come to town, and they come to town regularly, what's, from an M&E standpoint, what's the impact? But what I do think is powerful about Power for Africa is it does get you thinking about not just grid-tied renewable energy, but off-grid renewable energy. Renewable energy as a class is an infant industry in Africa. So one of the challenges is you don't have a lot of people who understand how to use solar technologies. We're principally in Africa big dam-driven electrification. We don't have a lot of nuclear. So, there's an educational process, is what I'm saying, in terms of how fast Africa will adopt solar technology. So training, and that's where we were trying to reach out to the American Association of Blacks in Energy. You've got people of African descent with skills. They work for, Power and Light, Florida Power and Light, and all these different companies. They've been doing it for 30 years. Translating that knowledge into something that can train people on the continent, that's another process. But it is a process that needs to be undertaken. Project developers. The thing about it, and it was mentioned about the ability of a country to borrow, the credit worthiness of a country. Grid-tied renewable energy depends upon the government being able to be the off-taker of record. But if you don't have the political rating to do that, then you're stuck. And many countries have found themselves not being able to be the off-taker of record. So those projects, the big projects, are struck. As a company, Africa Business Group, we've created an entity called Africa Business Energy, and we're focused on mini-grid development. Now, as I've studied mini-grid development, the challenge is its early stage, it still requires grants. So how do you find impact investment? A term they use, blended finance. So there's public capital, there's private capital, and you're supporting the process of the development of this mini-grid, and you're looking at productive use. What can you do in that rural area or peri-urban area to allow you to pay for the electrification? Because again, in many parts of the world, it's a public good. Historically, that's what electrification was. But Africa doesn't have the capital to build the power plants that are needed to now address demand. So if you're going to bring the private sector in, but they want a return, it takes some engineering, financial engineering. And that, again, the skills to do that are not everywhere. And so it's a process. I missed the colleague's comment about China in Africa, but I'll just extrapolate. I mean, I think there's some countries, as been mentioned, where there's a larger Chinese population. But again, I think it's incumbent then upon the governments, and I think the governments are coming to this to say, what is the optimal mix of Chinese influence in our society, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's goods. In Ghana, there were Chinese who were illegally mining, alluvial mining of gold. And the government really clamped down on that. And they pushed them out. It didn't mean they pushed them out in perpetuity, but they said, this space is our space, sovereign. We can do this. We don't need you involved in that. And so I think as those things emerge, and they're ongoing on the continent, you see a different role for China. But the one that is playing without competition to me is big infrastructure. Nobody else is competing. Thanks.
First, let me ask you to give our panelists and our moderator a really big round of applause. I think that this has been one of the most open discussions that I have taken part in or listened to on private sector trade and investment, and the role of the diaspora, some of the constraints and the issues, and the way that it has been discussed. It's been one of the more eye-opening panels that I've ever had the pleasure of listening to. So I really thank you for your candor. I'm going to sum up as best as possible. There was a lot that's put on the table. There are points that I probably captured, but I might not capture in my comments here. But I wanted just to hit a few high points that struck me and that continued maybe to come up throughout the discussion. And there will be, of course, the recommendations that will be a bit more synthesized when we do the report for the policy forum that we're holding tomorrow. One of the things that I just wanted to mention is when I was with the U.S. Angola Chamber of Commerce, I had one of my bankers, and he used to always preface his comments by saying, Angola is for the marathon runner, it is not for the sprinter. And I think that that's something that we heard here as well, but with regard to the continent at large. It's a long-term game. It's not something you can go in and make short shrift, get your investment returns, and run out. You've got to be prepared to stick with it and go the full gamut. I think what also made this discussion a bit different today is that it was, you continued to say, this is the 21st century. And I think for many of us, we tend to stick to discussions that are focused on a certain model, a certain way of thinking, and I think you're pushing us today to really begin to look at some issues and concerns in a very different manner that we may not have done before. A lot was mentioned about youth, about the young people, about education and training and empowering them, because many of the things, many of the obstacles that people of this generation, my generation, your generation maybe, have faced, the young people may not have some of these obstacles. They can take the foundations that have been laid, whether they're already on the continent, whether they're here and going back, and really do something with it. And I think you used a very powerful example when you talked about the MBA, and I happen to have been associated with some of the things that Amadou is doing as well. And when you look at MBA, and I will say WMBA as well, because they're very much engaged in what's going on, and that's just one example of young people who are coming from the continent, but also using what they have as a platform to be able to not just do the sport, but to do much, much more with it. And I can think, you've mentioned several players, and there are a number of them who are using that platform for good. And then we'll hear more about things of that nature this afternoon, because we have Jidenna, who is a renowned recording artist who hails from Nigeria and America, who will be discussing this. So the candor, and again, there was another word used this morning, mastery of the topics, I think changed the conversation, and importantly so, not in a very cliched manner, and that's important. This term political economic settlements, particularly pushing policy recommendations that we may be able to come up with, because that's really the purpose of the Ron Brown series, and each panel is to make recommendations to the AU and to the US government. So I kind of take it for CFA itself as a call to action. It's something that we can look at in terms of how do we engage Congress, but not just Congress here in Washington. There are constituent groups in Michigan, in Minnesota, in New York, in Los Angeles. How do we also incorporate local governance structures and their constituents as a part of that discussion? And how do we come up perhaps with maybe a political or a structure that enables us to have that voice, to push lawmakers and others who are involved in the policy arena to rethink things on access to capital, to rethink issues around how do we really approach trade. We had examples from Reverend Weaver about looking at associations, the Hotel Association, banking relationships, and how do we promote these? How do we incorporate these into that dialogue to make something that is tangible and real, not just in terms of the political discussion, but look, we have this, and we want to make this happen with these groups of people. There's a bank, for example, in Chicago that went into partnership with a group from Ghana, and now it is one of the NBA banks, and it is effectively an African and American bank. And I personally am working on another potential investment, a large investment from an African group that really approached me as saying, we want to become a part of an African-American financial institution. Can you help us make that happen? And so I think having these types of examples and broadening that are clear examples that we can bring to lawmakers, policymakers, to say, look, this isn't just talk. This is really about something. Business tourism was also brought up as a vehicle that is perhaps a little more user-friendly in terms of exposing people and educating them to the opportunities and some of the realities. The issue, I'll just kind of incorporate it, but media and so forth, we'll just talk about Brand Africa and the Africa Matters brand. I think there is a lot that needs to be done still in that space, and Kenya elections just keep coming up to me. If we had, seen death and carnage on the continent following that election, it would have been all over the pages. But that they have done something that very few, if any, countries that I can think of, recently at least, have done, have had an independent judiciary, call back an election result to say, no, it has to be redone. That is historic. But, what I saw in the Washington Post, for example, was this.
Yeah.
a poster on the bottom of the page of the international section. And, you know, we really should be able to talk more about these types of stories, and not, again, just of the Dangotes in terms of business, but there are others as well that we should be able to work with and to champion. The focus narrowly, I really liked that because on the one hand, yes, we do have a large continent. It's growing, you know, exponentially in terms of demographics, but at the same time, you do have pockets that have niches of reality that are more common to others, so East African communities, SADC, or ECOWAS, or others. And how do we make that more effective in terms of looking at a market base and where we may be able to get bigger bangs or bigger wins for investment opportunities. The inclusiveness involving youth. I heard talk about needing for structures and platforms. We do have home strings. He now calls it movement capital. In fact, we wanted Eric to be with us this morning, but he's on a mission promoting his investment platforms elsewhere. But yes, why were there difficulties here? Why did Eric actually have to move to the UK? To do home strings when it is a diaspora platform that he wanted to utilize, and it grew out of actually a CFA meeting, if truth be told. And he had to incorporate in the UK, and he's only now getting certain types of license to be able to operate here. But the strictures of the SEC were such that maybe not. We need to know a bit more of what's out there and what others are doing, so that when we do have these discussions, again, we're having them around tangible things that are actually going on, because there is a lot more going on, I think, than we're giving credit to, and we really need to capitalize on that in terms of structuring this discussion and structuring the opportunities so that they are relevant, and they are relevant in 2017 and forward, not 2017 kind of stuck coming out of 20 years ago, we passed AGOA and so forth. I think that is as much as I can get out of my notes for the moment, and hopefully we will be able to synthesize that a little bit better. Kingsley, you're back. I think I'd like to give the last word to you in case you have anything else that you'd like to add to this discussion. If not, as usual, you are provocative, but in the best sort of way that I always like to listen to. And again, the panelists as well, very candid, very masterful in their discussions, not the usual discussion that I think many were expecting or are used to. And so again, thank you. And we look forward to having you this afternoon for our discussion with youth empowerment.